everyone. My name is Grace Beatty, and welcome to Wicked Women, the podcast. On this podcast, I will be discussing with leading experts some of history's most infamous and maligned women. Within each episode, I do not look to excuse or dispute the wrongs committed by some of these women, but I do strive to bring a more holistic and rounded understanding of each particular woman's story. Step back in time and come on this journey with me as we discover the lives and legacies of these fascinating women. In today's episode, we will be talking about the infamous Anne Boleyn, the doomed second wife of King Henry VIII of England. Many people are at least minimally aware of Anne Boleyn, or if not, there is a plethora of resources on her throughout the internet, libraries, museums, and more. So for today's episode, we're going to be focusing mainly on Anne Boleyn's story after her death, and the ways in which her legacy have been interpreted by later generations. Joining me today will be Natalie Grueninger, the creator of the podcast Talking Tudors, and a lifelong Anne Boleyn fan. I will also be speaking with Adrienne Dillard, a historian who focuses on overlooked women's stories. She is best known for her novel The Raven's Widow, focusing on Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford. When people think about wicked women, Anne Boleyn is usually one of the first names to come to mind. It seems that every generation has its own version of Anne. Slutty Anne, religious reformer Anne, innocent Anne, manipulative Anne, sexy Anne, evil Anne, educated Anne, feminist Anne, the list goes on. Thousands of people flock annually to locations Anne once walked, such as Hampton Court, Hever Castle, and the Tower of London, and gobble up documentaries, films, and TV series that come out regularly devoted to her story. Henry VIII may have tried to eradicate Anne's memory after her downfall, but that only seemed to fan the flames of public fascination with this historical other woman. While Henry dreamed of possessing her in the flesh, subsequent generations have become determined to possess her memory. Born sometime in 1500, Anne was raised in a family of minor nobility, but with a mother descended from the powerful Howard family. In 1513, Anne was sent to the court of Margaret of Austria, and then to the court of France, in the train of Henry VIII's sister, Princess Mary, on the occasion of her marriage to the French king. These childhood years had a powerful effect on Anne. Seeing women in power who openly spoke their mind and had open views on religion helped shape Anne into the woman she later became. As Natalie Grueninger states,
if we remember where she was raised, where she grew up at the court of Margaret, Archduchess of Austria, and then at the court of Queen Claude, where this question of the nature of women and how they should be portrayed, this debate has been going on since the 15th century in France. It's a very active debate, and Anne is in fact, she has these examples of women that rule. She has Louise of Savoy, their incredible woman. She has Marguerite de Navarre. She has Queen Claude. She has amongst that kind of group that she's seeing and that we think she's spending time with is another incredible woman called Anne de Graville. So she was a French, very erudite woman and a poet who actually was disinherited by her family because she chose to marry for love, another one as well. We think she chose to marry for love. She married her first cousin and her family was not happy with that. And she was this incredible poet and definitely inspired by Christine de Pizan's work in the 15th century and this question of women and power. And so Anne has all that example. She's very observant. Anne is always watching and always learning. And so I think, why not? Why can't we see her as at some point thinking, well, why shouldn't I have power, especially once she's queen? So I think once she's queen, Henry expected her to be a certain way, what's expected of queens, submissive, quiet, just, doing what their husbands say. But of course, Anne wasn't raised to be like that. And she had these great examples. And Catherine of Aragon as well, another formidable woman who Anne looked up to from very young. One of the first letter we have of Anne's is a letter where she's basically saying she can't wait to come to court so that she can serve Catherine, and she wants to do it so well. So, that's a roughly 12-year-old Anne who wants to learn and to be very, to be highly educated and cultured so that she can do justice when she comes home to serve Queen Catherine. So she's got all these examples. So I think it's possible that she thought, that she did want to wield some actual real power. But as I mentioned with that quote before, this is exactly what Henry didn't want. And I think it was actually just in her nature, to be honest with you. My personal opinion is that, and there'll be people that will disagree with this, but I think that Mary Boleyn was in fact the eldest sister. I think she was older than Anne, and I think the fact that Anne is first sent to the continent speaks to her intelligence and her wit, and I think this is also supported. We find evidence to support this in Mary's own letter, the only surviving letter of Mary Boleyn, which is a very long letter that she writes to Thomas Cromwell when she's lost favour. She's lost Anne's favour. She's lost George's favour. She lost her parents' favour because she's married a man without permission. And she's married a man beneath her station, importantly. That's probably the most important thing. And so she writes, and you get a good sense of how she has felt like she's sort of been in their shadow, in Anne's shadow for a long time. I think she was a very special personality, and one that we don't see all the time, could inspire really fierce loyalty. And we see that with, even though the men accused alongside her are so pressured to admit to this crime that none of them have committed, they don't. Even when faced with the most horrific end possible, which was a traitor's death, they still just don't incriminate her or say, okay, yes, this is, they just don't, but there's no bargaining there. Only, of course, Mark Smeaton does admit, but we always have to remember that poor Mark Smeaton was not a gentleman like the rest, and he would have faced the full horrors of a traitor's death, which was hanging, drawing, and quartering, had it not been commuted by the king. So you have to always keep that in mind when you think of his admission of so-called guilt. Yeah, so I think strong women, they scare people, don't they? Like in the 16th century, like I said earlier, women were seen to be inferior in all aspects. So, there's this idea that women have to be quiet, that they have to they're either controlled by their father, their husbands, their brothers, some man in the family. And when you have a woman like Anne, who, of course, we should remember also was the first woman, when she was made Marquess of Pembroke on the 1st of September, 1532, she was the first woman to receive a hereditary peerage in her own right. This is a huge, big deal. Nothing connected to her relationship with Henry. Well, we can argue that, but she would have kept this for herself and her children had she not married Henry. That was the idea behind it. So that is a huge deal for Anne. So, and then, of course, when she's crowned as queen, she's crowned with the crown of St. Edward the Confessor, which is normally reserved for reigning monarchs. Like, these things are big, huge milestones that occur in Anne's life. And I do think the fact that she was outspoken, there's this idea, outspoken women, like a sort of trouble, that's that sense that through history we've gotten that if you talk too much, or that kind of idea. So I think it has contributed in some way, but it's wonderful to look at and to explore and to see how in the same way it's inspired a lot of women, and men as well to do. I know that her courage, Anne's courage, has always inspired me. And whenever I'm faced with anything even slightly challenging that I start wanting to, complain, or I think of Anne and I think of the courage that she showed in her life and the perseverance. And I like to think that Elizabeth, her daughter, would have done the same and thought about her. So that same outspokenness that kind of attracted Henry at the beginning, he loved it in his mistress. He then despised it in his queen. He couldn't stand it. Still inspires people today. So I think in a way, it was a good thing. We're still talking about her, 500 years later, not just talking, but some people will get into very big heated arguments about her. She's still, this is what amazes me. She still polarizes opinion, but she also still inspires that sort of fierce loyalty that she inspired in the 16th century. I don't think people ever looked at Anne or George Boleyn or Thomas Boleyn and felt sort of indifference. Like, I don't think they ever, I think you either loved them or you really despised them. They're sort of those people that were always kind of divisive and polarizing, because I think of how quite brilliant they were, and that doesn't rub everyone up the right way. And I think they were confident. I think they were confident in their skills and in their talents as well, which in the end grated on poor paranoid Henry.
Returning to England in 1522, Anne quickly caught the attention of Henry VIII. Many popular histories and fictional portrayals paint Anne as having her eye on the British crown from the moment she returns to England, plotting and planning a path to the ultimate seat of power. What is often ignored or misrepresented as canny sexual manipulation is Anne's continual refusal of Henry's advances. It is only once it becomes clear he will not take no for an answer that it appears Anne sets her sights on a bigger prize than just royal mistress. As Adrienne Dillard states,
Anne was very ambitious, and I think that she had, I do think that she went into it as, not necessarily at the very beginning, because I don't think that she was very interested in the king at the time, right? Because she wanted to make a really good marriage that was kind of beyond reproach, and but she did want to move up, right? She wanted to marry Percy. She wanted to move up, and I think that she kind of had Mary's example ahead of her of, you don't want to fall into the trap of being with the king, right? But I think he really tried to woo her with these love letters, and he was promising her these things, right? And he was just so determined and persistent. And I think she kind of thought, well, I'm in this position, right? I am being put in a position of power right now. And I can influence the policy at court. I can influence the religious establishment. I can influence a lot of these things that I shouldn't be able to influence because I'm a woman and I'm a commoner and I'm and for a woman like her who was really smart, she was like, this is a really good situation that I have somehow been put into. And, it's not good in the fact that I have to supplant this other woman, but, she was like, I can change. I can make our court so much more progressive than Catherine can. And she can't even have any kids anyways. Like, she can't give the king an heir. She can't. So I think that she very much justified. There's actually a quote that's from the Book of Common Prayer that says, what the heart desires, the mind justifies. And so I think in her heart, she wanted to use this power, for the good. I'm going to make the best out of it. Right? I'm not going to be like Mary. You're not going to set me aside because I'm going to make damn sure that you can't. And actually, she did make sure he couldn't set her aside. And I think that that's why he inevitably killed her, because he couldn't see any other way out, right? So in the end, it kind of worked against her, because when she did finally say, okay, I'll go into a nunnery, I'll recede from, he was like, oh no, I tried that before and it did not work. So we're going to just stop this from ever going any further. So it worked to her advantage, but also to her disadvantage at the very end. Oh, I still think it's a pretty common idea. But at the same time, because of the progress that women's movements have made over the years, people are starting to not see that as a terrible thing, right? Even if she was just, her ultimate goal was the throne, what's wrong with that, right? She saw what she wanted to do and she was working towards that. So I think that we just are finding ambitious women less shocking, which is great.
Natalie believes this is one of the most common misconceptions when it comes to Anne's story.
If we're talking about sort of myths or misconceptions about Anne Boleyn that I think I've come to understand in 20 years of studying this period or whatnot, is that one of the most pervasive and I think entrenched misconceptions is this idea that she woke up one day, disgruntled with her life and decided that she was going to topple a brilliant and well-loved queen. I think there's no evidence to substantiate that, I don't think. In fact, I think the evidence paints a very different picture, a much more complicated, complex, nuanced picture of what happened. I don't think there was ever a day where she woke up and decided she was going to, take Catherine's crown. I think we forget that they had history, that there's years of loyal service to Catherine of Aragon before Henry's eyes sort of turned towards Anne. And I think we forget also that the decades of loyal service that the Boleyn family gave to not just Henry VIII, but also Henry VII before him. And, and that there was so much at stake for them. They were a family already on the rise. Thomas Boleyn was greatly admired and respected by his contemporaries, a brilliant ambassador and a brilliant man. And he'd raised his children to have, obviously, the best life possible. But I don't think he'd raised them to one day take over and be queen, and I think there was a lot at stake. They were open to people, of course, being jealous of them. He knew that. So I think it's not the case that it's such a simple sort of black and white story. I think there's a lot more to it and a lot more factors that contributed to it. I think there is a point where Anne decides that she can do good via this role. I think her faith had a lot to do with it. And I think she really, at some point, thought that this is God's plan for her. And that's why she then sort of moves down that road. But no, I don't think she just simply woke up one day and thought, I'm going to be Queen of England.
Henry and Anne's courtship, known at court as the King's Great Matter, lasted until 1533. And during that time, Anne rose to the role of queen in all but name. This leads to another negative element of her story, the fact that for the majority of her relationship with Henry, Anne was the other woman, and Catherine of Aragon was Henry's wronged queen. Anne Boleyn's depiction often feature her at odds with other women, whether it be Catherine of Aragon, Mary I, Jane Seymour, Jane Boleyn, or others. For many people then and today, one of the most unforgivable parts of Anne's story is how Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, was treated. Many have accused Anne of being the instigator to the cruel abuse of Catherine. For both Natalie and Adrienne, it shows a common thread in much of women's history, a concept of pitting two women against each other within a historical narrative. Here's Adrienne.
I really think it just plays into the archetype that has kind of dogged women for centuries. Like, we like to catfight. We like to, undermine each other and work against each other. And to some extent, I think that does happen. And I don't think it's because we do that on purpose or we're bad people, but I think that the world likes to pit us against each other, right? And so we see that still happening time and time again. And plus, like, we as women, or as not as women, but as humans, we love scandal. We just love drama, right? And so you see it, and it's really fascinating because everybody is always pitted against Anne. You have Jane Boleyn who's pitted against her. You have Jane Seymour who's pitted against her. You've got Catherine of Aragon who's pitted against her. And not just because they were vying for the same man's affections, but because, we see Catherine as as they saw her then. She's old and she's boring and she doesn't have fun and, she's very uptight. And Anne is very clever and smart and all of these things, right? And so I think people just can't help themselves. You never see men really pitted against each other in that way because there's always this underlying, kind of like in this between Thomas Cromwell and Henry VIII. Like, obviously, towards the end, there was this drama and this fighting, but at the same time, they're both shown as these very respectable men, and they're just fighting because they have such strong beliefs in what they believe and, you know, the power that they're trying to get, and like it's inevitable and it's okay. But women, you know, we don't get that same perspective. Especially with Jane Boleyn, because we like to see her, you know, peeping in keyholes and causing like distension between people and lying and manipulating and all of these other things. And it's just, you know, I mean, these women were so busy just trying to live. You know, of course, there was probably some gossip and there was a little bit of sniping, not even just among women, but among the men. We just don't talk about the men doing it, right? I mean, there's always a little everyday strife and all of that. But I mean, for the most part, like these women, they're trying to have babies and raise them and like, you know, survive in this man's world that's really cutthroat. And the funny thing is that there's so much evidence to the contrary. Like Jane was a big part of the Boleyn family, and she helped Anne, and she was there in moments that Anne really needed somebody to support her, right? Because her sister Mary was banished, and she needed a contemporary who would help her. And time and again, we see that Jane shows up. You know, and even in like the coronation, she rides much higher than what her position would dictate. She's right there behind Anne on one of her greatest triumphs, you know? So it's like there's so much evidence to the contrary, but gosh, they just love a cat fight.
And Natalie believes,
I think we just like to pit one against the other, and you know, there's brilliant stuff being done now to show their connection rather than, you know, what united them rather than what separated them. But it's the same with Jane Seymour. It's difficult because Jane Seymour is a difficult one to get to know because obviously her time was very brief and she was kind of, you know, a lid was put on her pretty quickly by Henry. In fact, not long after Anne's execution, she is trying to sort of stamp her mark politically and make some quite bold statements. And Henry basically says, just remember the last one was executed not because she had had sex with 5 other men, but because she actually meddled with state affairs, is what Henry tells her. So, you know, very quickly shutting her down, go and entertain yourself in other ways, basically, don't even attempt it. So even that already is like an admission from Henry that it's not that Anne committed adultery or treason, it's the fact that she intended on ruling and she wanted to rule. And she wanted to make a difference. So, you know, I do feel for Jane because I think that must have just been an awful moment where she thought, oh, goodness, you know, what is happening here? But yes, I think this idea of pitting people, I don't know why. I'm not quite sure. Is it a human thing that we like to have drama, or I don't know. You know what I mean? I don't know exactly what it is, but there is definitely this idea that if you admire Anne, you can't admire Catherine. That's impossible. Whereas, of course, that's so untrue, you know, and again, I would remind people of the years they spent together, you know, the years that Anne served her, and there are no records of anything untoward happening in that time. So we can surmise that it was, you know, a perfectly good working relationship where she served her queen well. She was trained for that, of course, at the best courts in Europe. And they would have eaten together, laughed together, worshipped together. There was just all of that element that I think we lose when we make this just, oh, Anne stole Henry and, you know, that sort of thing. So I think seeing the things that these wonderful women had in common is much more rewarding and interesting than just thinking, oh, they were rivals for this or rivals for that.
After removing Catherine from court and visiting France alongside Anne, where it is believed their relationship was officially consummated, Henry married Anne in a secret ceremony in January of 1533. By June, Anne had been crowned Queen of England. 3 years later, in 1536, to the astonishment and horror of many, Anne Boleyn was executed under charges of treason and adultery, becoming the first queen in English history to be executed. Anne Boleyn had become well known throughout Europe during the King's Great Matter, and her reputation was rarely positive. She was seen as the King's great whore, who ensnared him in her sinful ways, taking him away from his devoted wife and the Catholic faith. This image of Anne has been challenged by academic historians for quite some time, but her negative reputation still appears regularly in media portrayals. As Natalie states,
I think there, as you say, there's been some work done to rehabilitate her and to show a more nuanced portrayal of her and a more complex woman, I suppose. But, you still get, of course, people that find their way here through novels like The Other Boleyn Girl or films like that. And that's perfectly fine because it's a great starting point. You get interested, you want to go into research. The problem is when that's used as kind of evidence of, what Anne was like and those sorts of things, that things get a bit complicated. And because I have for many years run a number of social media accounts and have this sort of online presence, I definitely see that she is still, there are some people that kind of still see her as the homewrecker, the seductress, the woman that stole Henry from Catherine, the rightful queen. And this view is still, it's being questioned, obviously, and Anne's got a lot of support out there, but there are still people that do believe that and see that kind of view of her, which is, I suppose, a little disappointing, but it is understandable though. But it's I think the story is just so much more complicated. People want a simple answer, don't they? Why did you do that? What happened? Why did she die? But there really aren't any simple answers. It's all a very complicated story. They were humans. They were very layered, as we all are. They were doing the best, making decisions on the spot with the knowledge they had. I think we forget sometimes with the Tudors that they didn't have the benefit of hindsight. We know how this story ends. They didn't. They were just like us, waking up every day and thinking, okay, what's going to happen today? How am I going to respond to this? How am I reacting to this? Just humans, really. And I think, sadly, we see this in general with responses to crimes against women nowadays, don't we? Oh, she drank too much, or she was wearing something that was too provocative. Like, it's a tragedy, really, that we're still having to discuss these things, that these things are still an issue. But I think with Anne, definitely there are people that would say she deserved it. Of course, look what she did to Catherine. It's karma, isn't it? And, you see this over and over in commentary online, and it's sad that they take such a simplistic view of it, of course, because what happened to Anne was horrific. It was brutal. It was, a shock even to people living in the 16th century, because I think sometimes people think, well, they were accustomed to executions and, losing people that they loved and gruesome stuff. But this event still completely sent shockwaves throughout England and Europe. It was just unheard of, and it was brutal. It was calculating. It was really what the king did was dismantle and take down the Boleyn family and any supporters. And this was a very calculated thing that he did. I don't agree with the view that, he believed that she was guilty. I don't agree with any of that. I think if we're looking for somebody to blame, we have the king. And that's, I think, where of course, he had Thomas Cromwell there that aided him, etc. But I don't know why some people choose to kind of let Henry off the hook. I really think that, that Henry has a lot to answer for in this situation. I think it has to do with the fact that we want to believe in their love story, don't we? We really want to believe that this was a great love story, that they were in love, that they fell in love, and that then something happened to cause the king to not love her anymore. So I think, if we believe that Henry somehow thought that she was guilty of those crimes, the punishment for treason in Tudor England is execution. You can kind of go down that path of he couldn't do anything about it. Of course he could have, but you can kind of run with that. And it kind of saves that love story a little bit, doesn't it? If he had no choice, if he had to execute this woman because she'd committed these crimes, you can kind of let him off the hook and still believe in the love story. It's much more complicated when you realize that Henry knew she was innocent. Then it's very hard to kind of reconcile the king that could be so charismatic and so loving and so romantic and, with the king that ordered every single detail of his wife's execution. It's just difficult. And I think sometimes we like simple kind of responses, simple answers. And this just doesn't have one, unfortunately.
Anne Boleyn's story has become iconic, not only for her unexpected rise, but also for her shocking downfall. Films like Anne of a Thousand Days capture the startlingly short amount of time between Anne's coronation and ultimate execution. This aspect of Anne's legacy has intrigued people for generations and often sees them return again and again to her story, trying to comprehend the unimaginable. While many people are familiar with the 6 wives of Henry VIII, Anne often stands out among them. She has more films, television series, and books focusing solely on her story than any of the other wives combined. She overshadows the narrative, even when another of the 6 wives, Catherine Howard, was also executed. But what brings Anne's story to the forefront? As Adrienne discusses,
she defied so many conventions of what it meant to be an English woman, because obviously, she was raised in the foreign courts, and so she had a lot more of the typical behaviors and the attitudes that you would find in these other courts that were, by virtue of where they were, they received so many more of the trends before England did, because England was an island unto itself, right? And so they weren't very far behind, but the people who were in France and in the Low Countries, they sort of were a little more progressive than the English court was. And so she brought this kind of new and exciting way of looking at things. But then I also think that her death was just so shocking. Even people who didn't even care for Anne were just shocked because, a queen had never been executed before, particularly in such torrid circumstances. And, I always say everybody loves a scandal. So it was just this huge scandal and just this monumental thing that happened to this really bright star. And so I think that really contributed a lot to it. It is still as shocking, but not in the way, I guess it's not surprising. It's almost like people are, okay, we've seen this before. It's just not as, I don't think it hits people quite so hard. And I think that's really true even today. The way that people talk about Catherine Howard is so vastly different than the way that they talk about Anne Boleyn. There really was no evidence at all that Anne did what she was accused of, right? And though there really isn't much more evidence that Catherine did what she was accused of, I think that the propaganda machine of the Tudor period was in high gear. By that point, it had had a lot of practice and it had a lot of steam, and it knew how to work. And so there was a lot of, I think, the way that it was treated during the time period, it was oh, she actually did deserve this. Did you read that letter? Did you and look at the way she behaved beforehand. And I still think to this day, there's just a lot of misogyny in the world. We have this view of women, and we see Catherine as just this empty-headed, good time gal who like to have fun and, like to sleep around. And we still, as a single woman dating today, I'm in my 40s, and there is this perception of even the way that men treat us, right? They send us unsolicited gross pictures, and they expect that, we're going to put out on the first time, and we're going to, and I think that that's the way that Catherine Howard was viewed, because she was very strong in her sexuality, right? But part of that comes from the fact that she was groomed to be that way. So they ignore the grooming, and it's like rape culture today. Well, what were you wearing? What were you doing? Where were you alone? So I think that definitely has a big part of it. Whereas people see Anne as like, oh, this is really shocking. And she didn't behave in the same way as Catherine. Because a lot of her stuff is, we talk about her being a reformer, like, right? Her Protestantism, her links to religion. But Catherine doesn't have that. So it's really unfair because both are equally shocking and equally undeserved. But there are all these other aspects to Anne that we ignore when it comes to Catherine.
People learn about Anne Boleyn through a myriad of ways. Some meet her for the first time in school while learning about the tumultuous Tudor dynasty. But just as many learn about her through those books, television shows, movies, and museums. For our two guests, they learned about Anne through these routes. Here is Natalie.
Look, if the accent hasn't given me away yet, so I'm a born and bred Sydney-sider, so I live in Australia. So I suppose the good thing for me is that I kind of came to this with a bit of an open mind, open slate, because we don't learn British history at school here. So unless you go yourself and do some digging and some research, you probably won't even encounter them, to be honest, until sort of after school, or depending what your interests are. So I didn't know very much about her when I started, looking into this period, which I think is a good thing, because I think we all, if you learn about her at school, you've already got some preconceptions that are going to be difficult to get rid of as you're, looking at different sources and things. So I really didn't know very much. That is the honest truth. It's been a long time now that I've been researching her life. So obviously things have changed, but at the beginning, I just knew the very sort of basics, that we know about her, but didn't learn about her at school. So a little bit different to how some other people have come to it. It was like so many, I think, you probably have heard this before. It was a book, in fact, that first inspired my interest in the Tudors. And it was a book that my sister lent me. Maybe you've read The Secret Diary of Anne Boleyn by Robin Maxwell, which is a sort of classic. I think if you love the Tudors and you haven't read that yet, add it to your list. It's been, I don't know how many prints, it's like 20 something, print. And yeah, it's amazing, translated into all these different languages. And Robin is fantastic and very lovely and wonderful to chat to. So it was that book that sort of first ignited my interest in the Tudors. And then I just so happened to be going on a trip around Europe. But I had a couple of days in London prior, and I asked my sister, what should I see? And she's like, well, definitely go to the Tower of London and definitely go to Hampton Court. So I did do those two things. And I have to say, Grace, it just absolutely fueled the fire. I was just immediately captured by this idea that I'm standing somewhere where people stood 1,000 years ago. I'm looking at a building that was 1,000 years old. All of that just absolutely captured my imagination. And I think with Anne, I remember standing at the tower, and it wasn't there's a lovely sort of memorial there now, but it was only a plaque that just listed the people that had been executed at that point. And I remember seeing her name and just thinking, oh, I really want to know why this happened. How did she go from Queen of England to suddenly being executed here? So I think I've kind of devoted my life to answering that question, to be honest with you.
And here is Adrienne.
Well, ironically, it's kind of funny. I think that the first time I ever heard mention of her actually was when I was in like middle school. So I think I was probably like 12 or 13. And we just like literally was just kind of a mention of her and Henry VIII. And mostly it was about Henry. It wasn't really, I think she just was mentioned once. And I never really thought about her again after that until the other Boleyn girl came out, and I took my mom to see it. And it was so funny because like my mom, she doesn't really know anything about history. She just kind of like went along because I wanted to go. And through the whole thing I was like, this isn't right. No, I don't think that happened. No, I'm not sure how I feel about this. And I didn't know anything about her, right? But it was just like some kind of instinct in me that said, this doesn't sit right with me. So of course I had to go out and start, reading about her. And that's how I got interested. It's interesting, even just since that movie has come out, seeing it's almost like it inspired all of these, Talking Tudors and the Anne Boleyn files and the Tudors. Like, it inspired all of these things to kind of come into existence. And just seeing how the perception of her has changed over the last 2 decades has been amazing. That's crazy to think it's been like almost 2 decades. Even though she was, pretty terrible in that book and that movie, you still felt this empathy for her. And, I know that Natalie Portman is probably not everybody's favorite Anne Boleyn, but just seeing her at the end on the execution block or scaffold, and feeling what it was like, what it must have been like for her. And then you also had this really deep empathy for George Boleyn and Mary Boleyn. And, I think that reflects in Anne as well, because we see her compared to the two of them. And yeah, she is a little different, a little more ambitious, a little more bold and snarky and sarcastic, but at the same time there's this tenderness inside of her that you witness as things start to unravel and she's panicking, and I think that we just, as humans, we connect with that suffering. And so I think it really did inspire a whole different way of looking at her.
Anne Boleyn's appeal has never waned. But in recent years, she has taken on a new image as a feminist icon. Her ambition, manipulation, and sexuality, so reviled by previous generations, are now often celebrated as proof that she was a woman well ahead of her time. But she has also taken on the persona of a religious reformer for many today, attempting to combat the negative versions of Anne and instead focus on her charitable efforts. As Natalie points out, this has become a prominent aspect of Anne's story in media portrayals.
Yeah, the question of how much Anne influenced the English Reformation is a big one. And again, another one of these things that is absolutely hotly debated and people have different views. I definitely think she played a role. How much of a role is obviously tricky to assess. But so one of our accounts suggests that Anne, in fact, suggested a solution to the great matter to Henry. And that was, of course, the work of William Tyndale. And a particular work called Obedience of a Christian Man. So this is a scene we have seen fictionalized because, it's a powerful scene for Anne if this is how it played out. But basically in this book, it's quite, there's a lot of things in it, but it basically argues that argues for the supreme authority of the scripture in the church, so the word of God, and the part that Henry loved, of course, argues for the supreme authority of the king within his own realm or within the state. And the story or the account that we get from the Elizabethan period is that Anne had marked some passages to show Henry read, and I can't remember them word for word, but there are things like if one of Henry's subjects sins, then he should be judged by the king, nobody else, just by the king. But if Henry sins, he should only be judged by God, and no one else could kind of say anything about that. Henry is only answerable to God, whereas his subjects are answerable to him and nobody else. So there's no room for the Pope in this version. And Henry loved it. And he apparently said, well, this is a book for me and all kings to read. That sort of line has gone down in history. So there is, of course, this possibility that this is true, that Anne definitely owned books by William Tyndale. Her 1534 edition of the Bible translated by Tyndale still exists, still in the British Library. So she definitely was interested in reform. She had a genuine interest in monastic reform. She had a genuine interest in getting the Bible out there in the vernacular and encouraging people to to read the Bible in their own language. And she, in fact, owned Bibles in French and in English, and encouraged her ladies later when she was queen to read them in English. So it makes sense that she played this part. That does make sense. But unfortunately, what's difficult is to assess where Anne's influence ends and where Henry's ego took over. Because I think, we know Henry had the size of Henry's ego is impossible to actually even describe. When you know that you are, there's God and then there's you, that obviously plays a big part in this story. He doesn't see himself as answerable to anyone else. He loves the idea of being supreme, head of the church in his own country. He loves the idea of getting rid of the Pope. This is all, this all really appeals to him. So I think that she definitely did play a role, but to what extent? Would Henry have gone down this road had it not been for Anne? I don't know, because he really did all of this so that he could marry her. So, would it eventually have happened? Yeah, probably, because it seems that things were heading in that direction. People were more interested in these questions of reform and all this sort of stuff. So I think she played a part, but I think the fact that she's a woman obviously has also played a role, because, as I'm sure, Grace, that in this period women were seen as inferior in every aspect. So intellectually, physically, emotionally, morally, importantly morally, and they were seen as a sort of corrupting element, as an element that could tempt people to do things that they probably shouldn't do. So I suppose if you're not happy with the decision Henry made to split from the Pope and you don't want to blame him for it, she's an easy scapegoat, isn't she? Anne's religious beliefs, I think, perhaps had she lived longer, may have evolved into what we would now call a Protestant, but certainly she wasn't at the time. She was what people loosely called evangelicals. She didn't subscribe to some of the radical ideas that were around at the time, like denying the sacrifice of the Mass. When she's in the Tower, in fact, twice she asks for the Holy Sacrament and she affirms her innocence on it. And just the day before she's executed, she invites the lieutenant of the constable of the Tower, William Kinston, to come and actually witness her taking the sacrament and affirming that she had never been disloyal to Henry in that way, which is basically, it's like taking a lie test now for people in the 16th century. She's on death's door and she takes Mass and affirms her innocence. This very quickly got to Chapuis. He had a spy in the Tower, the imperial ambassador, who must have thought, well, what is going on here? Because that is very, very strong evidence of her innocence. So Anne definitely rejected papal authority. Obviously, that's one of her views, but she didn't subscribe to these more radical ideas. She definitely was profoundly committed to the Bible. That is one thing we can say about Anne. And we can also say that about her brother George as well. They were both profoundly committed to the Bible. And I think this is one of the sort of main areas of reformers, if we call them loosely reformers at this time. But it was such a fluid thing, during Anne's lifetime. There was no real set ideas yet. People were kind of discussing things. And there were lots of things that couldn't be talked about at court because they were just too, they caused just like things like purgatory, the meaning of purgatory, the pilgrimages, saints, marriages of priests. There were so many issues that were too contentious to discuss, but they were the things that were being talked about while Anne was alive. So I think we can say that she took an active role in monastic reform. We have evidence of that. We have evidence of her profound commitment to the Bible. We have evidence, of course, that she didn't support radical ideas, that she rejected the Pope. And then there's all the other great sort of sides of the reformers, which is about championing education, about trying to improve the lives of the more needy people. And she definitely did that, absolutely. And this idea of quality education and that it's worth investing in. As a teacher myself, I just love that. That's one thing that I really connect with Anne on. And she promoted scholars, she promoted other reformers. She was sort of seen a little bit like a sort of a safety net, during her time, her ascendancy and her time as queen. If people got into trouble on the continent or whatnot, having books that were banned, they did tend to reach out to Anne. Anne herself owned many banned books and was able, of course, through her influence to not get into trouble with that. But yes, this idea that she was this Protestant martyr is one of the views. And I think we get this, of course, from the Elizabethan period. And it's just being carried on as well. because when they're trying to rehabilitate Anne, they're trying to curry favor with Elizabeth, who is a Protestant. Of course, they're just reading the story backwards there again. But she probably would have gotten there, I think, had she, been allowed to live longer. But I think important to note that neither her or Henry were Protestants. People I think sometimes get confused because he kicked off the Reformation. They think, oh, he wasn't. Henry was very conservative, in fact, and walking his religious line was really tricky because you could not go too far one way or the other, or you would find yourself on the executioner's block or, burnt or something, which was even worse. So yeah, too far. Yeah, very dangerous to know exactly, what was too far. But Henry was very conservative. And I think that is another misconception that, this idea that he wasn't really a Catholic. Henry died a Catholic man. That's sort of the bottom line. Yes, he brought in some changes. There were some things that were being questioned, but Henry himself was always very conservative. Of course, he was raised a Catholic. That's all he sort of knew. This is what he'd been sort of known from childhood. And I don't think the problem was ever the sort of dogma or the points of religion. I think it was more, as we've said, that he really enjoyed this idea of not having anyone as an intermediary between himself and God. And the fact that we see, in 1534, these kind of acts of parliaments are passed, and basically they stop people from being able to reach out to a foreign power, to appeal to anybody else. He is the power and the only power in his realm once all those acts are passed, and it makes it very difficult for anyone to challenge him on absolutely anything. It's very dangerous, and that's why we see, of course, members of the Pole family fleeing overseas, because it's an impossible situation. You either agree with Henry or you die. That's basically your two choices that you have. And so very difficult and challenging time for the English people.
However, Anne Boleyn's life and legacy is still hotly debated. It seems we will never stop arguing over her, admiring or reviling her, reinventing her, or discussing her. Within the surge of reinterpretation, many of the negative opinions and misconceptions surrounding her story have stayed. While there are depictions of Anne as a modern feminist icon, you will still see portrayals such as the other Boleyn girl, showing Anne in a shockingly bad light. For Natalie, people's opinions on Anne Boleyn have always been divided, and she doesn't see that changing anytime soon.
It's still quite a bit of a mixed bag. I think it depends on your generation. It really does, and depends on, I suppose, your moral code and whenever we're looking at history, we're looking at through our own lens, aren't we? So it's sort of tricky to say, but I think generally, yes, there is this feminist, obviously, angle now, which is wonderful. But like I said, there are still the people that can't quite get past the fact that she was the other woman, and that causes them a lot of difficulty, and they're not able to, they feel that an injustice was done to Catherine, and it was 100% absolutely. But I think laying the blame on Anne is just an easy way out again. Like, I don't think, I think it's a much more complicated story. And if we want to learn from it, then certainly getting below this sort of surface level look at, oh, well, she's the other woman, and Catherine was the sort of saintly one that was set aside. It's the same with the treatment of Mary, who became Mary the First. People don't like, for some reason, to blame Henry for that. It is just, let's just blame Anne for Mary's treatment. The sad thing with that aspect is that Mary found out very quickly after Anne's execution that, because her life got a lot worse, that it was in fact her father that was, that was pulling the strings. And so that's an interesting thing, a little bit off topic, but interesting. So yeah, I think going a little bit deeper, looking below surface level, I think it's generally positive. We're seeing her inspire a lot of young people, a lot of websites and blogs and podcasts obviously coming out to study her, which is absolutely fantastic. But I think we've still got some work to do as well. She has this far-reaching effect, and it really crosses boundaries. I'm currently running a course on Anne Boleyn, a year-long course, and we have people from many different countries. In fact, we've got more people from outside of the UK than there are from the UK. So I think that's a really impressive legacy in itself. But I think it's the fact that Anne she's flawed. She's beautifully flawed, in fact, and that's one of the things that attracted me to her in the first place. There's so much mystery that surrounds her. We love a good mystery, don't we? We love when we're not sure about something and you can dig deep and try and work out the answer. So there's mystery. There's a lot that's unknown about her life. There's a lot that's debated, even the things that, we don't even know when she was born. And this is just still a hotly debated issue today, how she spent her time while in France. There's no documentary evidence of that. There's just so much. So I think that mystery element is very appealing. Whereas if we look at somebody like the brilliant, absolutely wonderful Catherine of Aragon, there's more things that are certain. We know more that element of mystery is not really there. Of course, because she was raised to be a queen. So there's that. And I think the fact that there are all these questions leaves Anne really open to interpretation, as we've seen over the centuries. She's kind of re-examined, and she's, people try and rehabilitate her. But what we see is in all these Annes of the centuries, like the Elizabethan Anne, the Victorian Anne, we see a reflection of the preoccupations of that time is what we see. So she's sort of reinvented and made into be whatever is our concerns at the time. So she's open to interpretation, which I think then leaves the possibility for people to connect with her in many different ways. I think she is, I think there's a kind of mysterious quality to it too, which in a way is the same when you meet people today. You meet someone, you immediately get on with them. And sometimes people suggest, they're part of your soul family, or they're this and that, to try and explain that connection. I think the same thing happens with historical personalities. Sometimes you read about a person, they're interesting, but you don't have that connection. And then someone like Anne comes along, and she does inspire that kind of loyalty to a lot of people and that connection. And I do think it has to do with the fact that that she's open to interpretation, that we can kind of connect with different aspects of her. And she's still very, she inspires a lot of young women today, which is wonderful to see. A lot of men as well, but there tends to be a lot of women interested in her story. And I think that's because of course, her intelligence, her perseverance, her wit, her talents. So I think it's the fact that she's flawed, that we can see aspects of ourselves in her, and that there's this variety of aspects that we can actually connect with as well. And it is an extraordinary story too, isn't it? Just in general, it's perhaps not the exactly rags to riches story that it's often painted to be, but it is an extraordinary rise to power for this woman. And you sort of can't make it up, of course, with Henry. And, he moved heaven and earth to marry her. It took him a good 6-7 years. And then within 3 years, she's dead. And not just her, but her family is crushed. And the lives of obviously the men accused alongside her ruined as well. And I think that left such a huge gaping hole at the Tudor court. And I think it's a hole Henry tried to fill for the rest of his life and was never quite able to, because the people he got rid of were brilliant, larger than life personalities. And although he never would have admitted it, I think he must have just somewhere in there just thought, what in God's name have I done? Really, they were larger than life people. So I think the part of it, is also the story, which is just incredible.
For Adrienne, it can be difficult to fully reinterpret a historical person that has been seen in a negative light for many generations.
I don't know. Maybe it could be, we could say like maybe it's laziness, or maybe it's budgetary reasons, like, they do this scene because it costs less to film something that's a little more subtle, or, any of those reasons. But I think that also is just like, we as humans, we tend to have blind spots, right? So, and what I think is really fascinating is that, there is a recent book that came out about Jane Boleyn, and there are so many things in there, like the language even that's used, that are really problematic. And when I called that out, that author was like, well, I've been writing about these women for so long, and, they're calling me misogynist and anti-feminist and like all these things. And it's like, well, I'm not calling you that. I'm calling what you've written that. And that's not even me necessarily like saying anything bad about it, but bringing it to your awareness, because maybe he isn't aware how that could be viewed as being very anti-feminist and very, because at the end of the day, he's male, right? He's got a different perspective. And it doesn't necessarily have to be something that they've done on purpose or something that they're trying to do to make the person they're writing about look bad, right? I mean, I have found myself having misogynistic views before because our culture is so built on that, right? And the only way to fix it is to bring awareness to it. So I think a lot of it is just we're conditioned to view women in this way. We're conditioned to write about them in these terms. We're conditioned to view them in these archetypes of like the sinner and the saint and the mother and the barren woman and the, and so the only way that we're going to work out of that is to bring awareness to it. So I think that's a lot of it. I mean, I think that the tide is slowly turning on that, but you find people who are really just like huge supporters of Catherine of Aragon, and there's this whole Team Aragon, Team Boleyn, and I get that, right? Because we all have our favorites and that we all connect in some ways. And, for as much as I absolutely love Anne Boleyn, let me tell you, when I was going through my divorce, like, I totally was like, I understand Catherine of Aragon now. I would listen to that song from Six, to her song from Six. And that was what got me through like those days where I was just really struggling. And so I do get like we form those attachments, right? And so, yeah, I mean, I still see people who really love Catherine that just, they cannot bring themselves to say anything nice about Anne. It's hard to try to reframe that. Just because we're working against centuries of viewing, women as being at fault for a lot of these domestic issues, right? I wish I had a silver bullet that could change that. I think it just comes down to we just keep repeating it, right? Just keep repeating it over and over again. And then eventually it does click.
The active fight and discussion around reinterpreting Anne Boleyn could have far-reaching implications for other wicked women's stories. The desire to see Anne in a positive light drives people to dig deeper into the sources surrounding her. People are encouraged to see the nuance around contemporary reports and search out the direct information for themselves. This is a skill people should bring to all women in history. They all deserve to be seen as whole and nuanced human beings. For Adrienne, this is one of Anne Boleyn's most enduring legacies.
I want people to see her as this woman who was really confident and sure of herself, and to not see that as a bad thing, right? Because we want women to be confident and assertive and sure of themselves, and to chase after their dreams and chase after the things that are important to them. And, Anne very much did that. I don't know that I believe that she ever was in love with Henry. I think that in a way she viewed him as a means to an end. And obviously I think that they were very well matched in their mannerisms and their intelligence and the things that they loved. Like they were actually a really good match. And so I think that in the end, like, they could have been really great companions, right? Because there was just so much that they had in common, and they could debate things and challenge each other. But you can't do those things with a king, particularly a tyrannical king. So, but I just really want people to see, like, she was not afraid of her convictions, and she did what she thought was the best course of action, the most efficient course of action, which I think we as women should do, right? So that's what I hope they take away from that. Because everybody is a shade of gray, right? We're never black or white. We're a shade of gray. And that's how we need to view her, because she did have some, she could be kind of cruel and vindictive, and she could. I mean, she did, right? But I don't think any of us can say we never had those moments where we were just so focused on what it was we were trying to accomplish that we did not speak in the best way. I know I've been guilty of cruelty in my past as well, right? So I think that, we need to also view those acts in context of her time and her position and all of these other mitigating factors. I love seeing Anne in so many forms and seeing her life kind of examined in, more in detail in different areas. So, we've got Natalie Grueninger's book, which really focuses on her last days, her last year. And you have, Natalia Richards' fiction book called The Falcon's Rise. And I actually just got done listening to the audiobook of that. And it was so fascinating because I never really thought about Anne as a child, really, and so I just love how people are starting to sort of focus on different areas of her life that we've really kind of missed out on.
Meanwhile, for Natalie, the concept of legacy when it comes to Anne has many facets.
Legacy is an interesting one, isn't it? Because I think people automatically always think about a sort of tangible thing. And of course, the first thing that comes to most people's mind when you say legacy and Anne is Elizabeth I. For a Boleyn to at the end of this extraordinary story, for a half Boleyn to be on the throne is quite exceptional. I think that is the other reason why we're so captivated by this story, because of what we know, happens during Elizabeth's reign. And we sort of feel like Anne's been vindicated a bit in a way. So that in itself is extraordinary. But I think more importantly, for me, what I would like to see is less, when we're talking about Anne, less division. I would like to see sort of more unity. I've seen how her legacy and how her story can inspire real changes in people. And I've seen how it can connect people from all walks of life, from all over the globe. And I think that's such a beautiful thing. And if we focused on that and learning about the sort of positive aspects and the example she set in terms of courage and perseverance and intelligence and wit and all these sorts of things, that would make me very happy if I didn't have to respond to, what about Catherine? And what about what she did to Mary? And what about how she stole Henry? Like I would love not to have to. And most of the time now I don't respond because I realize that there's nothing that I can say to those people that's going to actually change their mind. Anne was not a saint. Somebody else accused me of that the other day. They said, I really enjoyed a podcast episode that I did, but I didn't like how you painted Anne to be this saint. And I thought, oh my goodness, I've never said that ever. In fact, I love the fact that she's so flawed, that she is so much like us, and she was not perfect, of course not. But can anyone listening claim to be perfect, to have never done anything and then thought, oh, that probably wasn't the best choice that I made there? I just don't understand this judgment of her how can we judge if we ourselves are not perfect people? And as I've said already before, Anne had this incredible side, but she also had, she could be very rash. She had a temper on her. There's no doubt about that. I think sometimes her actions were counterproductive. She acted before she kind of thought it through, which we've all done at some point. So I admire those faults in her, because I think in the end, the courage and the dignity she showed just says a lot about her character, I think. And And she was very loyal and very committed to her family and to the people supporting her. So all those aspects I'd love for us to sort of carry through and let us inspire our everyday lives today. And just, of course she wasn't perfect. I don't think anyone is. And I think that's why people are so attracted to her story, because there's that, like I said, the element of mystery, but also just being able to connect on many different levels with her, I think is really important. The pressure that she had is often, and so when I was writing my book, The Final Year of Anne Boleyn, I wanted to really show the context of those sort of last 18 months of her life and place her, her downfall didn't occur in this sort of vacuum, which sometimes when we're looking at her downfall, we only look at the months of 1536, yet that we can learn so much from just going back a little bit more and understanding what's going on in Europe, what the political situation is like, what is happening at home and abroad, all very important aspects that contributed to what happened to Anne Boleyn. So this didn't happen in a vacuum. And I think sometimes we forget that as well. But throughout that time, yes, there are plenty of examples of her behaving in ways that you wouldn't say are very, very, very nice or very likable, But again, I would remind people that she was human. This is where I think we've seen them so many times on film, and we've read their names so many times in books that they've kind of turned into characters, haven't they? Not real human beings. They're kind of characters taking on these roles. Whereas I think it's important to remember that they were very, very human. And maybe, yes, different from us in certain ways, but also similar in many ways, and still felt all those emotions we feel, jealousy, hate, ambition, whatever, all of it, and woke up every day not knowing what's going to happen and just really did the best that they could do with the information that was, at their hands at the time. So, yeah, it's just such a fascinating story, isn't it? The destruction of the Boleyn family, the dismantling, the systematic destruction of this family and of the men accused alongside her was horrific and brutal and left a gaping hole for many people for, decades, and those family members would have felt it for the rest of their lives. So I suppose just thinking about it in those terms, just to have a little bit of respect for the people we're talking about. Again, before anyone says anything about Catherine, I have complete respect for Catherine. I think she was an amazing woman. And I wish that things had been different, because I think her and Anne would have just been a formidable team had they been able to stay on the same side. But obviously life presented them with different paths, and this is what is. But yeah, I do often wonder, what a team they would have made, those two. Yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it? Because while Catherine was alive, Anne was safe. It's another aspect to this extraordinary story, that it was in fact Catherine being alive that kept Anne alive and kept Anne safe, because Henry, throughout most of Anne's reign, really had Catherine to blame for all these troubles. Any trouble, it was Catherine's fault. She said, I can't have an alliance with the emperor because of Catherine. And then suddenly Catherine dies and Henry's left looking around for someone to blame. And of course, Anne is the easiest person to blame for all his troubles. So it's interesting that while she's alive, Anne is basically safe. Yeah. And then of course all that falls apart and Anne is left very vulnerable. And if Henry, there was no other way really, because had Henry annulled his marriage or attempted to annul his marriage to Anne as well, it's like basically saying, oh yes, I was wrong for all these years, and Catherine, the emperor, the pope, everyone else was correct. Henry is never, ever going to admit to being in fact, he doesn't. He's incapable of admitting to making mistakes. So to have annulled his marriage to Anne would have, in a way, admitted that they were right and he was wrong, that she should never have married her, that it's caused him a lot of problems, and then there's the issue of then their children, Elizabeth, then he's seen what's happened with Mary. She's refused to accept that she's not the rightful heir. Would Elizabeth do the same thing later on? Would people then come in support of Elizabeth? There's all these things that are left kind of open. And I think that it would have been like accepting the Pope's authority again and accepting that they were all correct and he was wrong. And I don't think he would ever have done that. So I think he was waiting for a solution that was more permanent. When she stood up at the scaffold so courageously and whatnot, she did ask that I think you probably know the speech, and if any person will meddle of my cause, I require them to judge the best. So I think just keeping that in mind when we are having discussions about Anne and about any person from history really